Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Picato from the Department of History, and I'm in charge of introducing the panelists today in this celebration of Professor Rhiannon Stephens' new book. So I'll read a bit about each one of them here, and then we'll have Rhiannon speak about the book and have them, we'll hear their comments, and then we'll have an opportunity to hear your questions. I wanted to mention that, this is the book we're talking about, and here are some forms that you can use if you want to get a discounted copy from Duke University Press, okay? Okay, so I'll start with Rhiannon Stephens. Is Associate Professor of History at Columbia, and is a specialist in pre-colonial and early colonial East Africa, from the late first millennium of current era through the 20th century. She's the author of the first monograph, Poverty and Wealth in East Africa. No, this is not the first monograph. This is the book we're presenting today. Poverty and Wealth in East Africa, a Conceptual History, that came out last year. And her first monograph is A History of African Motherhood, the Case of Uganda, 700 to 1900, published in 2013 by Cambridge University Press, which traces the history of motherhood as a social institution across over a millennium of Ugandan political, economic, and social change. She's also the co-editor of a book entitled Doing Conceptual History in Africa with Axel Fleisch is the co-editor. And we're very happy to have Rhiannon here and her second book in the flesh here. The other presenters that I will introduce him, I guess from right to left. Laura Fair is a historian of 20th century urban East Africa, and the author of several books. She teaches in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. And her scholarship focuses on gender, social, and economic change and urban popular culture in Swahili-speaking communities. Her first book is Pastimes and Politics, Culture, Community, and Identity in Post-Abolition Urban Zanzibar, 1890-1945. Most recently, Professor Fair published Real Pleasures, Cinema Audiences and Entrepreneurs in 20th Century Urban Tanzania, from Ohio University Press, 2018. This book won the Bethwell A. Ogot Prize, awarded by the African Studies Association for the best book in Eastern African Studies, and is going to be republished in by Sun Graphics in Nairobi. I guess it was already republished. Okay. Thank you for coming here. Professor Revin Jimenez is assistant professor at the University of Michigan. Her work examines the gender history of Nguni speaker. Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. In Southern Africa between the 9th and 20th centuries. So, Nguni speakers innovated and reconfigured masculine property and male relationships. And Professor Jimenez studies ideas of gender and how they allowed Nguni speakers to congregate young men into vast networks, define male identity, and establish obligations as sons and husbands. I'll mention 3 publications. One is entitled as a chapter, Intellectual History from Below, in the book edited by Rhiannon, right? A review of the book. Okay, sorry. In the Journal of African History, Slow Revolution in Southern Africa, Cattle and the Transformation of Political Economy Among South African Nguni Speakers. Then we have Professor Caterina Pizzigoni, here in the screen. She's Associate Professor of History, also at Columbia University, and is a specialist in the colonial history of Latin America. Her interests include indigenous populations and the study of sources in Nahuatl. the indigenous language in Mexico, one of the indigenous languages in Mexico. Social history, household and material culture, religion, and gender. Her current research focuses on household saints in colonial Mexico. And she's the author of Testaments of Toluca from 2007 by Stanford University Press, The Life Within Local Indigenous Society in Mexico's Toluca Valley, 1650-1800, also from Stanford 2012, and co-author of Indigenous Life After the Conquest, the De la Cruz Family Papers of Colonial Mexico, along with Camila Townsend, published in 2021. So thank you very much for coming here, for commenting on Rhiannon's book, and I'll give the microphone to Rhiannon now.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you to the Heyman Center, to ISOP for hosting this event, and a special thanks to Leah and Lindsay for all their work to make it possible. I'm grateful to Pablo Picato for chairing, to Raven Jimenez, Laura Fair, and Katerina Pizzigoni for taking the time to discuss my work. It's a real privilege for me to have you do so. As an undergraduate studying African history in London in the 1990s, I was introduced to the twin myths of Merry Africa and the Dark Continent, myths that had been mobilized by Europeans to justify a slew of wrongs, from the transatlantic slave trade to continued colonial rule well into the second half of the 20th century. In the almost 3 decades since, the academic study of Africa's history, not least by scholars on and from the continent, has transformed the field, challenging all kinds of assumptions and misconceptions. And yet, when it comes to the economic history of Africa prior to the 20th century, these twin myths of the merry and the dark continue to hold some sway. Thus, in the merry myth, no one on the continent was poor before colonial rule, or perhaps before the transatlantic trade, as they lived in harmony with an abundant nature and shared what little they had. And in the dark myth, everyone on the continent lived in abject poverty. Given the lack of availability of the kinds of sources that are typically used in economic history, the continued dominance of simplistic myths is on the one hand not very surprising. Reconstructing trends in gross domestic product for African societies in the first or second millennium is not only impossible, but would be largely meaningless. On the other hand, scholars have pushed us to rethink the nature of all kinds of aspects of society, including gender, sexuality, and political power for the deeper past. So why not economic inequality? And I'm exaggerating slightly for effect, of course. Some scholars have worked on these questions, and economic historians are increasingly working on topics in the colonial period and to some degree earlier. Nonetheless, the argument generally holds for the deeper past. The absence of quantitative data for Uganda before the colonial period, and the questionable nature of much of it even then, prompted me to consider other approaches and to explore the possibilities of conceptual history in particular. In so doing, I encountered a complex history of Eastern Ugandans' intellectual engagement with socioeconomic difference in their communities. Conceptual history was particularly appealing to me as an approach in writing this book because it foregrounds the intellectual work of ordinary people. This involves using language as a historical source, and language is valuable as a source because it helps us understand how people made sense of and reshaped their worlds. Conceptual history thus places Eastern Ugandans themselves at the center of their own histories, rather than applying external sociological models or privileging the writings of outsiders. A conceptual history approach also brings to light the complexity of people's understandings and ideological views of poverty and wealth, and the dynamism of some concepts alongside durability of others across very long spans of time. The twin poles of poverty and wealth have long preoccupied people living in what is today Eastern Uganda, with linguistic evidence dating back over 2,000 years. Furthermore, their understandings of what these economic extremes meant changed over time, sometimes circling back to concepts that existed in earlier times, and sometimes people developed new ones. Eastern Uganda in the early second millennium was almost certainly a place of limited material inequality, somewhere in modern economic parlance with the Gini coefficient much closer to 0 than to 1. Communities were not always uniformly poor, per the Dark Continent myth, but neither were they egalitarian, per the myth of Merry Africa. We know this because they have an ancient vocabulary for both wealth and poverty, including distinct ways of classifying the poor. There would be no reason to have such words if everyone were equally destitute, or if none were. The long history of what those economic differences meant, how people understood and talked about poverty and about wealth in Eastern Uganda, is what animates this book. In Eastern Uganda, the earliest written sources date to the closing decades of the 19th century. Writing histories for times and places prior to their documentation in written form requires thus an interdisciplinary approach. This way of conceiving of history is nothing new in African history. Indeed, the Nigerian historian Kenneth Onwukwedike wrote about it in 1953. But it remains somewhat unusual in history as a discipline, and even in African history, where research tends to be restricted to oral history alongside archival and other documentary work. For poverty and wealth in East Africa, I started with the words that people in Eastern Uganda use to talk about these economic concepts, drawing on the methods of comparative historical linguistics to reconstruct the words spoken by communities speaking ancestral or proto-languages. This begins with genetic classifications of the modern languages spoken in the region. That means understanding which languages emerge from a common ancestral or proto-language and the particular sequences by which that emergence happened. With this framework in place, I could establish which words were inherited from a common ancestral language, which were more recent innovations, and which borrowed from neighbors speaking a different language. In so doing, I created an archive of sorts, albeit a fragmentary one, composed of individual words. Once I had this linguistic archive, I overlaid it with evidence from archaeology, oral traditions, oral literature, local histories, ethnography, and paleoclimatology in order to contextualize and make sense of the concepts of poverty and wealth that people used at different points in time and in different places. Rather than assume that any particular concepts of wealth or poverty were the relevant ones for people in Eastern Uganda, whether in the 19th century or in the 10th, I wanted to identify as far as possible the concepts that people themselves used to make sense of economic difference. What I found was that how Eastern Ugandans understood poverty and wealth and how they made sense of what it meant to be poor or to be rich has varied widely across time and space. But for all the variety, I found that there were three broad ways in which they could be organized and made sense of. So people in Eastern Uganda understood poverty and wealth in social, material, and emotional terms. This underscored to me the impossibility of studying socioeconomic difference in purely material or economic terms, in terms of average daily earnings, for example, as popularized by the trope of percentage of population living on less than $2 a day. Instead, divisions of gender and belonging shaped ideas about who could be wealthy and in what ways, as well as how wealth might be acquired and maintained. And while wealth, in some cases at least, did take the form of people, in particular the form of girls and women, material concepts of wealth and of lack, whether in land, livestock, grain, or jewelry, were also durable across time. And people connected the poor and the wealthy with a whole range of emotions, including grief and disgust, and honor and anger. In the book, I showed that long before the developments of the 19th and 20th centuries, people in Eastern Uganda had changed their concepts of poverty and wealth as they adjusted to life in new places, among different people, to new climates, and to changes in their own communities. The complexity of Eastern Ugandans' intellectual engagements with these concepts stands out as a powerful reminder that colonialism and capitalism did not introduce economic thought to East Africa. It also challenges any simplistic tropes of socioeconomic difference in the deeper past. Societies in the region were neither egalitarian nor timelessly destitute, and rich and poor people living in those societies took the time to craft a dynamic and robust tradition about what those differences meant for them And I believe we should pay attention to that tradition.
Professor Jimenez?
Thank you for inviting me to participate today. Sorry, I'm a little bit hoarse. And for the opportunity to share some thoughts about wealth and poverty in East Africa. We don't get new contributions to early African history very often. So this was exciting to read for that reason, but also because it offers a compelling exploration of the ways historical linguistics can be used in the service of, and is perhaps especially well suited to, conceptual history. I want to focus my comments today on two themes: the revision of the idea of wealth and people, and thinking about affect versus evocation. So as Rhiannon notes in the introduction, histories of wealth and poverty before the 19th century are few and far between. And while there are exceptions, of course, social histories tend to use the framing of wealth and people, where abundance and standing are measured in the quality and quantity of relationships one can call on for the pre-colonial past, even as we have evidence of resource accumulation and economic difference. And for the most part, there's good reason for that. Histories of Great Zimbabwe, for example, suggest literal piles of gold and greater herds of cattle than the capital could bear. And yet there is plenty to suggest that throughout the region, prestige goods were most useful for reinforcing social ties. On the Swahili coast, archaeologists have evidence of wealthy community members who adorn themselves with riches to perform their wealth in public spaces. The sounds of coins tinkling on their clothing, announcing their value as members of society. And of course, we know from Rhiannon's earlier work and the work of David Schomburn that kinship and collective organization were vital in pre-colonial Uganda for regulating access to material wealth like land, as well as social forms of wealth like labor and reproduction. But what did people think about their fates and relationships when confronted with the glitter of adornment, the vast fields of banana gardens and pasture land, the symphony of lowing herds? That's something more often implied and explored, with wealth and people as a model, sometimes suggesting that social differentiation of this kind and the selective enrichment of a few patrons was something uniformly accepted and encouraged. What wealth and poverty shows us is that the discourse around economic difference and social standing could be far more complicated than desire, pursuit of riches, and even the pull of wealth. When the wealthy spoke about the impoverished, they did not always reference the possibility to attract new clients, pawns, or even slaves. Sometimes they thought of the disruption they felt, the torture even, of thin and despairing neighbors, and sometimes they thought of the selfishness of the poor, who kept every scrap of food for themselves and their household, offering none in shows of hospitality and friendship. Poverty, in this sense, set these thin neighbors beyond the sorts of reciprocal bonds so often conceptualized as integral to making and maintaining wealth in people. For the fortunate, wealth in people also didn't mean leveraging all material wealth into valuable networks of skill and support. Stephens references the Lunyole term omuhombe, which I'm kind of right, for an extremely wealthy person, likening their condition to the licking and scraping of food, and another, yai, for prosperity, which speaks to pillage and the snatching up of food at a communal table. So for every case of plenty inspiring a circle of loyal followers and the resources of human capacity, there were those who looked on, perhaps even those considered part of the wealth, who thought of the wealthy as gluttonous hoarders, or at least not in a positive light. Moving past the wealth and people framework, the conceptual history approach also offers insights into the ways people understood changing conditions and possibilities. After the experiences of drought and migration, Proto-Greater Luhia speakers thought about poverty in terms of deprivation and the pursuit of resources. Naturally, for their Lunyole-speaking descendants, the word hind pointed to abundance, but it could also specifically refer to an old field where cowpeas have recently been harvested. In eastern Uganda, where population density was relatively high compared to other parts of the region, the Nyolde speaker's use of the term suggests the acquisition of specialist knowledge in agriculture and environment, and a considered prioritization of land well suited to robust crops as opposed to any kind of plant. Beyond this important revision to wealth models and the reinsertion of poverty to the equation, one aspect of the book that stood out to me was the evocative nature of some of the word histories and whether they point to a history of affect. For example, in her discussion of Proto-West Nyanza, Stephens includes the root naku, one of many terms for poverty. As an illustrative example, she cites the Luganda proverb, "Rain falling on a poor person does not clear up, it remains on her his head." The proverb guides an interpretation of naku as a form of poverty that may endure in a state of chronic misery. Later in the same chapter, she discusses the root panan in Proto-Southern Nilotic, referring to a notion of poverty linked to the experience of kinlessness. Specifically, panan could mean pauper or orphan, and would later come to refer to a beggar. The picture of want that emerges from these two terms shows us a vivid depiction of what it felt like to be poor and what others felt about the impoverished. These also weren't vague categories. That's one reason why the reconstruction of word roots into different noun classes, as Rhiannon does, is so important. A concept for poverty as enduring misery existed, but a way of pinning that concept to a person with a descriptive noun existed too. The consequences of acquiring such a label, an orphan, a nuisance, a natural phenomenon embodied in a thin frame, or alternatively, a glutton and selfish person, made me think about Kate DeLuna's work in South Central Africa, where reputation for success and generosity became a way for hunters to differentiate themselves in their communities. DeLuna discusses this partly in terms of the role of affect as an important historical phenomenon. So one question I had was whether you think, Rhiannon, that concepts, and especially the class 1 and 2 personal nouns, reflect a history of affect, or is that more an artifact of emotional evocativeness in sappy readers like myself? Finally, and mostly from a methodological perspective, I want to note that this history required reconstruction of word histories in 2 broad language families, Proto-Greater Luhia, which is a part of Bantu, and Proto-Nilotic, which is not a Bantu language family. And while that may seem incidental, Bantu and Nilotic follow different morphological and phonological rules. And this shows a dedication to thinking expansively and exhaustively, even as that work must have been quite a bit more taxing. The result is a history that encompasses the full region of Eastern Uganda, demonstrating contact and the endurance of ideas across time and space. It shows more fully what the world looked like for the people pursuing wealth and enduring poverty in this part of
the world. And now we'll hear Caterina Pizzigoni.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is that too loud? No,
it's good.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for having me, even in this format. I'm sorry, I would have preferred to be in person, but I'm not in New York. So thank you for doing this together with me. And it will be a little bit awkward because I have only one screen. So I'm now switching to read my notes. So, you see me looking at the screen like that. Sorry, that is kind of impersonal, but I will try to make it. And there's a lot of noise in the background. I'm in a very noise village. So sorry about that, hopefully. So, I was thinking of what to say after reading your book, Rhiannon, that I read all of your work over the years, and it always gives me so much to think about. But I feel also embarrassed because as an outsider, a Latin Americanist and with 2 esteemed colleagues.
Caterina, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
can you speak a little louder?
Oh, yeah, of course. Let me also raise my volume maybe more. Can you hear me like that more?
No, I mean, I think it's the system cannot raise the volume here. So.
Oh, I see. Can you hear me like that?
Yes.
A little bit, so I just try to keep the microphone like this. I'm sorry about that. I know Zoom is a disaster.
No,
I'm
no,
sorry
it's not
that
your fault.
Okay, so thank you. Yeah, let me know at any point if there is something I can do better. So, I was thinking of what to do as an outsider, thinking also that probably the room is full of Africanists and there are two Eastern colleagues or Rhiannon in the panel. And I thought that maybe what I would like to do today is to share with you 3 points or themes I've chosen from reading Rhiannon's book. They particularly resonated with me, even if I could have chosen many more, because I got lots of notes from reading your book, Rhiannon. And I decided to do that using 3 statements, so quoting Rhiannon's words, also because through this book in particular, but all of Rhiannon's works, we understand how important words are and how much we should pay attention to the language. So I thought of using you and quoting you first. And the 3 quotations I'm going to use, they all come from the introduction. I read your book, but then I went back to the introduction and I selected these 3 as really encapsulating some of the things that you made me reflect upon. So the first statement I have from reading the book comes from page 7 and says, conceptual history foregrounds intellectual work of ordinary people. And that's something also that you, Rhiannon, just highlighted in your remarks. By reading your books, you really made me think of how, starting from the vocabulary of poverty and wealth used by ordinary people, we really come to an understanding of Eastern Uganda from within, I will say, through the words that are really adopted by Eastern Ugandans themselves across a huge span of centuries, instead of using external or foreign concepts. And as much as this seems to be, in a way, direct or normal, it is not from the point of view of doing history when you don't have documents. And so you really have to rely written documents from the people you're writing about. And you really have to rely, as Rhiannon shows, on different kind of methodology. So I appreciate that very much. And I think that one of the main gains of such an approach is really a radically different view of these societies. As you said, Rhiannon, these are societies that more often than not are depicted as egalitarian, I quote you, right, or destitute, as if individuals see each other all being the same or almost the same level in their society and always having been poor, more or less. And your work is showing that really by paying attention of the words these people use, we have, instead of egalitarian and destitute, we have diversity and dynamism. These are 2 terms I rescued in thinking about inequality and economic difference. So people that are too often conceived as a uniform group, attached to ways of life that hardly changed over the century, really emerge from your analysis as the exact opposite. As we really need to pay attention to their words, and you do it, and then the portray we get of these people is really completely different from what we are used to be thinking of from pre-colonial history, but also in more contemporary depictions of Africa, I would say. Second statement I got from the introduction, and I'm quoting you again, by taking a regional approach to this study, it becomes possible to see that diversity and the ways in which some concepts were shared or borrowed across communities, from page 2 of the introduction. And so in your research, the diversity and the dynamism become visible, especially because you have chosen a regional approach, reconstructing concepts and comparing them across all the 13 modern languages within this region of Eastern Uganda. And it's precisely the comparison of terms and their variation that allow us to see the sophistication of people's thinking in this early in time, and also their responses to the changing environment. And for me, this has been a very powerful food for thoughts. It basically made me go back to the regional and sub-regional approach I used in my own research, and to try to think harder about the reasons behind people's choices of different terms. And now through these choices, people reinforce the sense of local identity of belonging. With this approach, it's possible to see how concepts travel across communities, and something that is really not possible if we focus on one community only, as so often happens when we think of studies in my own field, Latin America, or if we focus on one particular language group, as I gather from your comments, Rhiannon, and your whole work often happens when we approach African history. And finally, my third statement, and I quote from page 18. This is categorically not to argue that climate determined the history of the people of Eastern Uganda any more than their environment did. What fluctuations in climate did do, however, was change the range of the possible. And I found this way to think of what climate does in history simply fascinating. Even poetic, if you allow me, is when you think of the words that Rhiannon chose to change the range of the possible. I like that expression very much. Even if it, more often than not, when we think of climate fluctuations, we think of ecological and human disasters, so nothing that has to do with poetry. But the way you put it that way made me really reflect on the role of the climate in your story. And I'm very interested to understand more how you use climate data, how you think of the role of climate in the stories that you reconstruct. And also given that that's where your more current research is going. So if there is time, I would love to hear more about that. So just to summarize, the 3 points or themes that I think in your work, Rhiannon, you've given in such a compelling way, among other, of course, that's my choice in my view, are a method to do history from within, to highlight diversity and dynamism and counter perceptions of uniformity and immobility. 2, the benefits of a regional approach. And 3, the role of climate and the use of climate data when we write history. And you don't have to reply to any of these comments or engage with any of them if there is no time. I'm very curious to see what the audience has to say about your work as well. But if time allows, I'm very happy if you want to engage with any of this. And I thank you all very much for listening to my comments, even via Zoom. So thank you for having me in this format.
Thank you, Kathleen. Professor Fu?
And they warned me this might be extra loud, so let me know if I need to move it. We're okay? Yeah, all right. So I'm delighted to be here today and to get to celebrate the release of Rhiannon's new book and to draw attention to just a few of the immensely important contributions that poverty and wealth in East Africa conceptual history makes. But before I delve into that, I want to begin by situating the book in Stephens' larger intellectual contributions within the historical profession more broadly. For quite some time now, the American Historical Association has been tracking changes in the profession and lamenting the rather rapid decline in the number of tenure-track scholars and new PhDs whose work focuses on periods prior to the 20th century. Indeed, in many history departments across the country, it's not uncommon to have 80% of the faculty focused on the 20th century. There are fewer and fewer scholars like Stephens with the aptitude and tenacity to devote their careers to studying the deep past, or the commitment to relentlessly remind us that we neglect the study of ancient times and peoples at our own peril. I should out myself here. I'm a 20th century historian. Rhiannon is in some ways the intellectual granddaughter of the founding genitors of African history. These early scholars who struggled to make a place for the study of Africa and the African past within the academy not only pushed the profession to recognize that people of color too made history, they also radically reshaped the historical profession by insisting that there were methods and tools that would allow us to recover the lives, actions, accomplishments, and thoughts of those who left no written records. From the get-go, African history was interdisciplinary, and to the present, its interdisciplinarity remains one of the field's key strengths. Drawing in and building on tools, theories, and methods from anthropology, religious study, folklore, linguistics, and a host of other disciplines, the earliest Africanists really helped to reshape and broaden what we think of as history and legitimate historical method. This book is a testament to the power and wealth of that interdisciplinary heritage, yet it pushes the boundaries even further. Historical linguistics is at the core of Rhiannon's methods for uncovering the life, worlds, and intellectual understandings of socioeconomic difference among the peoples of Eastern Uganda over the last 2,000 years. But she combines this with an amazing array of additional evidence drawn from what seems to be an encyclopedic grasp of regional archaeology, fables and proverbs, and ethnography. To this already impressive basket of tools, she adds 21st century methodological insights related to climate change, using data derived from tree rings, lake core samples, and pollen analysis. The time depth and methodological creativity that she displays here is utterly mind-boggling. Her skills as a historian and mentor are something any history department would be proud to claim and do everything possible to retain. If her methodological complexity and dexterity alone aren't enough to truly astound you, let me take a minute to just highlight the mind-boggling diversity of languages that are at the core of this study. Over the course of 2,000 years, Stephens traces the divergence of several groups of people into what becomes 13 different language communities. She did over 100 interviews with contemporary speakers of these diverse languages, exploring the usage of terms for poverty and wealth, as well as their synonyms, but also mined dictionaries, grammars, and written sources in 13 languages. These languages fall into two broad families. In one group, the languages might be as similar as French and Portuguese, which any person who speaks French but has gone to Brazil would tell you are not really all that similar. The differences between the two families is more akin to the difference between English and Chinese. So Rhiannon can correct me if I've overdrawn the difference, but you get a sense of how amazingly complex the study is and how rare her linguistic skills are. By combining and comparing this rich, diverse range of source material, Stephens allows us to see how over the course of several millennia, as people moved and migrated, traded and borrowed, and sometimes raided, ran, and sought refuge, their ideas regarding wealth and poverty diverged. Through her careful constructed word list, combined with archaeological, climate change, and other data, she demonstrates how the thought worlds and conceptual understandings of peoples in this region regarding socioeconomic difference diversified. As they made new communities and cultures and encountered a variety of different social and environmental challenges, wealth for some came to be associated largely with elders and men. For others, wealth was not gendered, but was related to producing large stores of grain. Over time, certain communities came to associate wealth with having large social networks and the ability to provide refuge to those in need. At certain points in the past, in some communities, wealth became synonymous with power and plunder, where in others the emphasis was on generosity and respect. By tracing these linguistic changes across a vast expanse of time and space, Stephens allows us to see social and historical change long before we have any written records. What these developments of new words and concepts further demonstrates, she tells us, is the intellectual agency of language speakers in these regions. When I first read this book back in the fall, what struck me most was the richness and nuance of these ancient peoples' conceptual worlds. When you think of poverty, what do you think of? This isn't a rhetorical question. Give me some, yeah, splurt, hunger. Hunger, anybody else? Homelessness. All right, we'll stop there. Hunger and homelessness, I only have 8 minutes. All right. For most of us, material lack is at the core of our conceptual understandings of poverty. For people around Lake Nyanza too, there were parallel material understandings. Poverty could be signaled by a lack of food, drought that led to failed crops, and hunger, a lack of housing, a lack of good pasture, or a lack of soil fertility might also be defined as poverty. But what struck me when I read this book was how far beyond the material these people's conceptions of poverty were. Lack didn't just manifest as material need. There were equally, if not more significant, social and emotional registers as well. There were an immense range of related words that tied together poverty and bereavement. Social vulnerability and emotional suffering had, in some cases, the same root as the word poor. Stephens points out that an individual who lost a spouse to death likely lost a key component of their economic stability and security. But she also alerts us to the fact that in the minds of certain language speakers, there was an equally significant recognition of the power of grief and emotional bereavement to leave people in want, in need, and thus desperately poor. Someone who just lost their life partner was poor on many registers. The root at the core of poverty encompassed and emphasized social and emotional relationships. That entire day and many since, I have been left contemplating how myopic 20th and 21st century American policy related to poverty is. Economic need is often only one small part of a larger entanglement. Our answer for homelessness is a cot in a shelter and a coupon to McDonald's, and most cities don't even offer this. This cot might address the barest physical needs, but it doesn't even begin to touch the lack of social connection suffered by an individual who has no one they can turn to for support. A homeless shelter for runaway teens might keep them out of the rain, but fails to shelter them from emotional trauma of severed ties with family, loneliness, or fear for their younger siblings left behind. Among another group of language speakers from the other quite distinct linguistic family, a root word for poverty is found in terms that convey hardship, trouble, molestation, and calamity. Some of those things might have propelled a teen to the street. But their related words built from that same root include grief, marginality, and causing to be sad. Wow. What if 21st century Americans and American policy were able to similarly broaden their understandings of poverty to include the whole person? That ancient peoples in Eastern Uganda conceptually enmeshed the physical, social, and emotional shows us that we have a lot we could learn from both Africa and the very distant past. And as Rhiannon skillfully demonstrates, ideas and practices don't just endure. People actively perpetuate them. We too could broaden our conceptual minds and take ideas from those with insights to share. Thus, like all good books, this one not only teaches a lot about a very specific subject, but leaves readers thinking long after they've put the book down and applying its insights to other contexts and their own worlds.
Thank you so much. Now, Rhiannon would have a chance to respond, and then we'll open to your questions, and then there's a reception in the next room, just to encourage you. Okay, Rhiannon.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Raven, Catalina, and Laura. I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed by your comments, which were incredibly generous. It's also really wonderful to hear how you read the book and hear that coming back to me, and sort of almost make me wish I could go back and make some revisions to it, although not really. So thank you, Raven, for your question about a history of affect, and I thought about that quite a bit as I was writing the book, because one of the things that really struck me in reconstructing the vocabulary and analyzing it and thinking through the different concepts that people had was the way in which these kind of emotional elements were so dominant, both in terms of poverty, but also in terms of wealth. And so the association of, in some cases, of wealth with honor and respect, but also the kind of the violent accumulation of wealth, and thinking about the ways in which that shaped the people who were both what it means to become wealthy through violence and what it means to be part of someone's wealth as a result of violence. And thinking about the ways in which, when that's in the noun classes 1 and 2, so in the Bantu languages, the classes that refer to people, right? So in Bantu language, rather than having 2 or 3 categories of gender, there are as many as 23 different noun classes, and words change meaning when they move between those. So the first 2 are the categories, the main categories for person and people. And so that when people are bringing those different elements of meaning and naming a person with those elements of meaning, that they're embodying emotions into the people that are being named in a way that I think is really powerful. And so I think it's there, but I sort of, in the book itself, I chose not to dive into a history of affect, but stick with poverty and wealth. But I was thinking a lot all the time about that, and that comes to your comments too, Laura, about how we think about these concepts, how people in the past understood them, and how that may have inspired them to act in different ways towards members of their community and members of other communities, whether to accept people who are fleeing a context of famine or deprivation, or to be hostile towards those people, to see them as perhaps being deceitful or cheating their way into something that they didn't deserve. And Katerina, thank you. So yes, the idea of climate, and so there's always it's a tricky balance between taking seriously changes in the climate and slipping into saying that a change in the climate is what's causing a change in a society. And so that's why I found the way of thinking about this as climate changing the range of what was possible, a useful way of doing it, that there's, within that range, people made many different decisions. But if the rain simply doesn't fall for 10 years, that does have a material impact on your life and on what you can do and what's available to you. But on the other hand, if the rain does fall and it falls well and it falls more than it had been falling, and that allows you to accumulate particular kinds of wealth, whether in food or in livestock, but also you run the risk of, if you have too much rain, that your ceilings wash away, or the grain that you have stored becomes poisonous because of the molds that are growing in it. And so trying to think about it in those more careful ways, rather than just thinking about, so that there was less rain, so that people must have moved sort of uncritically and fled in search of a better place to be, was productive for me. And that people made different kinds of choices, right, in response to climate. And that, so thinking about the root naku that Raven mentioned, that the meaning of that root changed away from an idea of poverty being a long-term, persistent experience to something more short-term, and that happened in the same centuries. And I have to talk in centuries. That's the data that's available to me. And so what day of the week was it that people decided to make this change? I don't know. But over the course of centuries, as there was less rain, as the level of Victoria Nyanza of Lake Victoria dropped significantly, changing what was available to people, they also changed the meaning of poverty. So was that because, and they changed the words that they used to talk about seasons as well at the same time. So what was that because more people were experiencing marginality, kind of the risk of tipping over into a really moment of crisis, that changed how they thought about poverty. And so I can't give a definitive answer, but it's just useful, I think, to think about all of that together. And Laura, so as you were speaking, I was thinking about being in Eastern Uganda in the 21st century. And it's a place that even within the context, so within the context of Uganda, Eastern Uganda is a place that is framed as poor, and using the kinds of metrics that get used today to measure poverty is a place that's much poorer than the rest of the country. And it's also a place that's just overflowing with NGOs who are all there to eradicate poverty or to teach people individual life skills so that they will escape from poverty, and who've been there for decades, and yet people are still very poor. And so, and some of those people are people coming from outside, and some are also people from the area who are making good faith efforts to try and improve the lives of their people. But, you know, so it made me think, like, why is this not working? And I don't think the lack of a kind of comprehensive understanding of poverty is the only answer to that. I think there's a lot more to it, but I think it's part of it, you know. So if you don't ask people what it would mean for them to move out of poverty in the first place, and instead you say, I'm going to teach you to be a hairdresser or a tailor or a brickmaker, and that's going to be your path out of poverty, it seems to me that it's almost inevitable that that's going to fail. Whereas if you actually take seriously those emotional and social connections, that you might be able to find a different way of operating and enabling people to find their own solutions. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah, you want to?
So, thank you. I see what you mean, Laura. Laura, when you were speaking, I felt you were, I haven't read the book yet, but I felt that everything you said was what I was going, how I was going to respond. Just first of all, Rhiannon, it's so impressive that you've done this work, let's just say it out loud, while you're doing a lot of other work for our community. So I want to applaud you and thank you for that. And just, I think, you know, as someone who spends time looking around the arts and sciences, I think one of the things that makes me most just proud to be in this community is the unbelievable devotion to your field, to knowledge, all those languages, and digging in. And we've talked about the importance of sustaining the study of languages, not just language and languages as something that's so crucial. And you know, your work is just such a perfect emblem of why that needs to happen. But I think the part of it that was really resonating for me is that it's the interplay between that level of detail and specificity and kind of commitment to something or some things, and the ability then to generalize and to move out of that. And when I see that, particularly in a young scholar, like you're still young in my view, a young scholar like you, I feel the payoff, you know, so greatly of this world that we're in. So the more specific, so that's my praise. My more, I guess, specific question is, having listened to these responses, are you still invested in the idea, sorry to use a wealth metaphor, are you still, you know, really interested in the idea of poverty and wealth as the categories? Because it sounds as if the work that you're doing here is showing us the ways in which those categories are problematic in this kind of deep historical way, that they keep mattering, but also, and again, you know, Laura was expressing some of that as the other speakers were too. So what, as a scholar who has seen the vastness of meaning that these two big terms are containing, how do you, feel about continuing, that's in your book title, how do you feel about continuing to work with those terms as kind of overarching ones that are so important across the globe today in academia and far beyond it?
Yeah, well, thank you, Sarah, for all of that. And that's a good question, because there is a way in which sometimes, we take concepts and we nuance them and we think about them in more and more nuanced ways. And then suddenly it's like, well, does this mean anything anymore, right? Is it so capacious that now it's useless to use because it doesn't refer to anything? But I think in this case, because these are the words that people still use today when they talk about being rich or when they talk about being poor, and so that sometimes they are used just to refer to, that person over there is someone who's really rich. But within the word that's being used are these other layers of meaning, and the word that they choose in any given moment among the range of words to refer to someone. So one of the languages that I worked with for this book is Lunyole, and they have 15 different root words for poverty alone. And that means that once you put those into the different noun classes, you have 30 or 40 different words or more that they could use. And so that suggests to me that poverty is something that they really spend a lot of time thinking about, but that, when they're choosing to use one word rather than another, it's because they understand poverty in all these different ways. And so they remain useful as frames. And I think they're useful too, because certainly in the African context, because it's such a focus of, in the West, as a place of destitution and of lack on the one hand, and of sort of extremes of wealth and corruption on the other, so that being able to think much more carefully about those two categories is something that is still productive.
No, there's someone at the back. Thank you, Professor. It sounds like very compelling research, and I'll be sure to read it once I finish my baby research. But I was very interested in sort of your translation process from these languages, proto-languages, to then how do you express them in the book. And I guess my question is sort of how, if you could talk a little more about the ways that you were able to translate specific concepts that were tied to like the morality of exchange. So sort of more tied to like the ideas of misery and misfortune and things that had a more of a moral connotation, how then that translates in your book through the terms that you use, and how also tied to that, how that translates with time and new contexts.
Thank you, Ana Rosa. And I'm looking forward to reading your not so baby research. Yeah, so it's an important question. It's a big question, right? So and it works, I think, in two ways, and one is sort of the challenge of translation across languages, which is simultaneously sort of impossible and something that we do all the time, right? And so kind of figuring out a way, acknowledging the difficulty and the complexity of translation, the idea that when we translate, we're always sort of compromising a bit in that process of translation. But also recognizing that it is possible, and that certainly it's necessary work, right? So, but in terms of how I did it here, so partly it's the way that I collected the evidence that I use in the book. And so by conducting interviews, I didn't just ask people, what's your word for wealth? What's your word for rich person? But then once they gave me the word, then asking, and what are all the other meanings that word holds? Or does that word have other meanings? What are the other meanings that you hold for that? Does it exist in a different noun class? Does that change the meaning? How does, and so allowing the different meanings to come across from that process of going back and forth between a gloss for wealth and then taking that word and understanding all the other meanings it held, and then going to those meanings and then taking that back again. So going back and forth in this way, and then mapping all of those different meanings, all the synonyms, all the homonyms that people had, was a way of getting a sense of the whole range of meaning that existed. The question of morality, I mean, so I think, in thinking about misery, or thinking about the example of, in one of the languages, Lubukusu, where the word for a rich person also means a respected person, and it also means someone who shoved somebody else aside, or took someone else's space. There you can start to think of a moral economy of wealth, right? That you can be honored and be wealthy, but maybe the wealthy also behave in dishonorable ways, and that there's a criticism that emerges from that. But there's also, some cases that the question of morality, and the fact that often the dictionaries that are available are ones either produced by missionaries or produced by people who are currently involved in Bible translation. So one of the words for a poor person, if you change the final vowel of that word, it gets translated as a prostitute, as a harlot. And so then having to stop and think, well, what might that have meant in a pre-Christian space, right? And so perhaps it's behavior that's socially transgressive, but the word prostitute is probably not a useful word to use in that context.
Thank you very much for this great research. And I just had a question that connects in part with Katerina's question on climate. Essentially, I was wondering if this analysis of the categories of wealth and poverty map also on the political, in a sense. In other words, both in terms of individuals, like is a wealthy individual also politically more prominent and so on, but on a longer sort of scale, there is research on how, for example, in China, environmental disasters also look back on, say, the dynasty that was ruling and so on. So I wonder if this correlation between climatic events like famine, animal disease, and so on, mapped also on the sort of political context in which these words developed, basically, in the political transformations, say migrations, changes of rule, and so on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Angelo, for that. So yes, so there are, there's a whole set of words that connect wealth and power on the one hand, and those cut across people speaking Bantu languages and people speaking Nilotic languages, although it's not universal across the languages, so it's happening in different places in different ways. But a recognition of that the wealthy may accumulate power and the powerful may accumulate wealth, right? And then that's also connected to the particular insignia that a powerful person might wear, and ownership of that insignia, marking their wealth as well. But there being real limits to that, and a really effective example comes from an oral tradition from the late 19th century, actually, and from a period of drought. So in a Iteso community where there was an Emuron, a Forcia, who had become very wealthy and powerful because of his skill in prophesying the outcome of battles and cattle raids. And so he had vast herds of cattle, and he had all these granaries, and this drought hit, and it coincided with a number of human and animal epidemics that you're aware of from your own work, and also with colonial conquest as a backdrop, even though it wasn't right in that area at the time. And so, as the result of this kind of whole slew of different factors, there was a famine that was very serious, and elders in the 1960s remembered this as a time of anarchy. People dying, people surviving by eating roots of water lilies. And people went to this emuron called Okadaro and asked for help because he had all this wealth. And he tried to make them pay for the food by working for him. And this outraged them so much that they just destroyed his household and stole all of the wealth in food and the wealth in livestock. And in Ateso, there is a specific word for wealth in food as well as the word for livestock. They seized it all. And so the idea that, yes, you could be wealthy and powerful, but that there was also a moral economy underpinning that if you were excessively greedy in a time of crisis, that there was a justification for violence.
Congratulations to start off with. I mean, I'm in awe of the erudition and the technical mastery, but also the writerly grace, because this enormous time span, this huge breadth of linguistic analysis is conveyed in a relatively compact book. So there is a kind of humility in the presentation of these very bold theories as well, which is exemplary. And maybe you've already started to answer this question, but I wanted to ask you whether there was a kind of other kind of myth structure to which you were speaking. And it's also a question about the historical, the empirical historical record. Did you encounter in these analyses a reason for thinking that there are changing valorizations or understandings of the value of equality? That is to say, you spoke about this as a non-egalitarian past. And of course, we know that lots of places in the world do not think that equality is a principle to be valorized, that there is virtue in hierarchy and virtue in the concentration of power and so forth. But we also have that other history, very prominent in African studies, but elsewhere too, that in moments of new kinds of accumulation, class-based accumulation, climate-enabled accumulation, conquest-enabled accumulation, there are also kind of emerging structures of resentment, envy, antisocial discourses and so forth. And that isn't the realm of affect that you've spoken about here. And I was wondering if that is one of the dimensions of the work that interests you, or whether there's something to say about moments in which there are different kinds of accumulation and the possibility that there are different affective registers for thinking wealth in those that link those two phenomena.
Yeah, thank you, Rose. And this also, it's a great question, because where wealth in people dominates discussion of wealth, witchcraft tends to dominate the discussion of poverty in Africa, and grounded in sort of ideas of jealousy. And so, that was something that was in the back of my mind as I was doing this work. And in fact, David Schönbrunn had reconstructed for an earlier period a word for poverty that was connected to jealousy. And so I was thinking, maybe that's something that I would find, and yet it just didn't come up. And even the root that's used for that in an earlier period in the region is that its meaning changes once it's being taken up by the speakers that I look at, or the speakers that I look at who take it up. And so I was struck I suppose, by the absence of kind of a discourse of jealousy or of evil or misbehavior, of that kind of affect in the vocabulary that I was encountering. But I do think that in some ways it's there, right? So it's there in the idea that a speaker community changed the meaning of a word to mean to shove someone aside, to take someone's space, that there's a criticism of the wealthy that emerges there. And that's happening also in a particular context. So Raven mentioned the kind of the population density. So that's happening on the slopes of Mount Elgon, Masaba, which is very fertile, but it's difficult to farm everywhere because it's so steep. You have lots of landslides and so on. So that the need to have access to land was particularly powerful, or access to land was something that was a bit more contested. Right? So in that space, a wealthy person who claimed more land could be criticized for having taken it away from someone else who needed it. And so it's there, but it's not there in the perhaps obvious way that I thought it might be when I started.
We have two questions. Maybe we can take them together.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, a book I look forward to reading. I have two quick questions. What would Marx make of your book? And how essential in the lives of these people are the issues of wealth and poverty?
Mine was just a very simple question. There are these two seeming extremes. Is there anyone in the middle and a language for them?
Yeah. So what would Marx make? I don't know. I think he would have he would have thought that the people that I write about were unimportant and unthinking about their economic conditions. So perhaps he'd have been surprised. How essential? I mean, that's like it's hard to answer that question, other than to say that they kept talking about them, right? And so that they were essential enough for them to not just keep talking about wealth and poverty, but to keep innovating different ways of talking about it, and that it was to maintain that level of intellectual engagement, I think, indicates that they were important categories. And what's interesting is that this is really, it's a context in which that there's very, from our standards, there's very limited socioeconomic differentiation, right? And these are not places that had kingdoms. They're not places that centralized power into states in ways that were happening just not very far to the west, right? Where you have these huge kingdoms that are immensely powerful and the accumulation of vast amounts of wealth into palaces and into chiefly households. This is not that. And so they were making decisions not to do that. And yet they continue to have this intellectual engagement with these concepts. And yeah, of course, there's everybody in the middle, right? And the reasons why the extremes get talked about, I think, is because they are the extremes and they're the ones that cause anxiety or concern or problem or tensions within the community. But everybody else is just the norm. And so why do you talk about them?
Thank you very much for the question. Thank you, Rhiannon, and the commentary. Please join us